It's a pleasure to be here. Welcome to From the Philippines to the World, Startups and Investors Growth Perspectives. My name is Rexy. Just, I guess, super quick introduction on my side. I'm one of the founders of an app called Kumu. We're a live streaming platform built by and for Filipinos. On one side, have become kind of the top highest grossing social app within the Philippines and top 10 in countries such as Canada, Kuwait, the United Kingdom because of the global Filipino community. And on the other side, kind of that economy powering. I think as of last count, about 600 people who are making a full-time income, mostly in the Philippines from Kumu. I'm excited to introduce or give the floor over to our panelists. So we have Minette and JP, and I'll just let them start off by just introducing the work that they've been doing, starting with Minette.
So hi folks, good to be here at Wild Digital. My name is Minette Navarrete. I run Kickstart Ventures. We are a fund out of the Philippines. We invest globally using 3 funds. A couple of funds for Globe Telecom, the #1 mobile operator in the Philippines, and a third fund, the Active Fund, whose logo you see here. All in all, a total of $240 million US. So investing in early growth startups, whether in Southeast Asia or overseas, beyond the region. And
JP, if you could tell us a little bit about the work that you've been doing the past few years and kind of how that's, if you want to go into a bit of how that's changed with a unique situation this year.
Okay, sure. Yeah. So hi, I'm really happy to be here today. And the company I founded and run, we're in the data analytics, decisions, and marketplaces spaces. So we operate B2B as well as B2C fintech business models in the Philippines as well as in Indonesia. On our enterprise side, we provide a proprietary decisioning engine software to Filipino and Indonesian banks. We also attach analytics and credit scoring to that. And then on our consumer-facing businesses, we have marketplaces that provide financial services, recommendations, and credit scores. And we do that in the Philippines under the brand name eCompermo. Really fortunate to have Minette on our cap table as well, and the support of Kickstart Ventures.
Yeah, just to echo that also, we just, actually for us, it was right before, was it 1 or 2 weeks before the COVID lockdowns when we officially kind of brought Kickstart in as an investor. And I think if that hadn't happened at that timing, it would have been a kind of a pretty different year for us. I guess with that, I'll start with one question for Minette and one question for JP, and just kind of we can jam from there. But I guess Minette, for me too, like I was born here, then I went to the US for a while, and then I started really coming back to the Philippines around 2014. And I think even then, right? So I guess that's 6 years ago now. It was Kickstart was one of the kind of institutions as early as then, when there weren't really institutions built around the startup ecosystem in the Philippines. So I guess before we go into kind of the current situation, how have you seen the kind of Philippine startup ecosystem evolve over that period of time?
Gosh, maybe it's important to say that startups have not existed in the Philippines only from that period of time. I mean, everybody's heard about startups like Chica, like Level Up, that I was an alumnus of, Entertainment Gateway, Information Gateway. So startups have been in operation in the Philippines for about 20 years or so, which is short relative to maybe more evolved systems. But like all the rest of the communities, they take time to develop. I think over the last decade, certainly we're seeing a bit more interest from corporates, from investors, both based in the Philippines as well as overseas. We've seen a healthy growth of angel investors, and that's been really good because it's a relay. And that's kind of how we talk about it within the community, that we need to cultivate investors at every stage of a startup's life cycle when they will need funds. community enablers, people who organize shows, people who organize training. They have picked up. There are more of them now. And government agencies. So we started, I think, 20 years ago, the IPO office, the IP office of the Philippines was quite active already. Before this, Monchito Ibrahim of ICT office, before we even had a department of ICT, some people from the government had already been quite supportive. And certainly in the last 8 years or so, the Department of Trade and Industry has come in, and we have seen also legislation picking up, probably the most informed piece of legislation coming from Senator Bamakino with the Innovative Startup Act. So you're sort of seeing the coalescing of private sector as well as public sector and community enablers. Startups around from many years back, I think now we see that they are more creative, more original. There is still something personally I feel about being a little bit starstruck about Silicon Valley. But I also see the budding of an identity. And we've seen this elsewhere. I've seen this in India, in Indonesia, in Thailand, in Brazil, where people start maybe with some idea of how it might be elsewhere, but over time, with confidence in themselves, with an optimism, they begin to see how they can bring a market-right cultural fit. And we are looking forward to seeing companies that are growing bigger, certainly like eCompermo C88 and Kumu and others.
Yeah, you brought up a lot of really great points in there, and one that I'll kind of segue onto JP. But I guess before that, I also wanted to get your thinking on, as you were describing kind of that chain and that relay, right, of institutions and stakeholders. Where do you feel is the biggest kind of the biggest gap, or where we can use more support within that? And is the answer now different from the answer in kind of at the time the Kickstart was launched?
I think in the beginning, the challenge was getting the investors more organized. And certainly now, I think there is such a lot of opportunity. I would love to see more angel investors, because as in the beginning, Kickstart had to be kind of that angel investor. But as we have demonstrated an ability to raise more funding, then what we can do is be the next step. So we can be Series A to C, but we would love to see more investors in the seed and the pre-A side.
Definitely. And yeah, I guess on that note, for JP, how have you, because you also have a experience where you've engaged deeply with the Philippines, but you also kind of work regionally and internationally, right? So kind of along the same lines, where do you see kind of the Philippines is in relation to some of the other startup ecosystems? Yeah, I guess also, like, do you agree with that point around the biggest, or where the biggest gap being in the kind of angel and early stage phase, or how do you see that and how it compares regionally and globally?
Yeah, thank you. No, it's a really interesting question. I mean, to provide a little bit more context, like my company and my co-founders and I, we've actually been in the Philippines developing software since 2008. So we actually, our roots in software development and with IT engineering actually are kind of, we've been there for some time. And we definitely have seen the industry really kind of evolve, right? And I think it's absolutely true what Minette mentioned, right? I think in the early days of a community and a country, as it starts to get its kind of IT industry rolling, obviously there's a lot of kind of sea turtles who come back and then bring, Silicon Valley perspectives or other perspectives from other global hubs. But then over time that coalesces into its own community. I mean, certainly when we got started as C88 in 2013, I would say the industry was still pretty nascent, but we've seen so much development over the past 7 years. And I think, each market in ASEAN develops very differently, right? We're not a contiguous area in the sense that California and New York are contiguous areas, right? And so kind of different trends affect different countries. In Indonesia, where we also have a significant presence, obviously it's a market that has been prodded, almost kind of forced into huge activity by just the size of venture capital and private equity checks that have gone into some decacorns. Obviously, in the Philippines, we've kind of gone in a little bit of a different direction just because the quantum of those investments haven't been there yet. Nonetheless, the Philippines is really developing on its own little track. And again, the quality of engineering and IT resources and IT personnel is very, very high in the Philippines. So it's a market we're incredibly bullish on. And look, we've been there since 2008, so we're not going anywhere. We'll be there, over the long term.
Yeah, actually, to kind of tie that back to one of Minette's earlier points that I thought stood out was kind of this idea of moving from being like starstruck by Silicon Valley and how other just kind of like taking as given, like how other startup ecosystems have done it, towards our own kind of like way of doing it that's uniquely and kind of built for the Philippine context. Like, I guess I'll throw this to either or both of you, but what do you think you're starting to see as the strengths of the Philippine startup ecosystem, and like what kinds of things are possible within the Philippines that might be a bit more difficult in other startup hubs?
I guess shall I go, Minette, or would you like to?
I'll let JP take first crack.
Okay, I'll take the first crack, and I'm going to approach it from a fintech perspective because that's what my company does. But I'll give you a quick example, right? So we have always had very strong interactions with Banco Central. And from an early stage of, I think, the fintech industry's development, Banco Central had people looking at the sector, and you could meet with them. They were very accessible. They were very open. Governor Diokno actually has been on public record, giving really wonderful speeches for several years, outlining a very clear and coherent roadmap for fintech development in the Philippines and how it can help the Filipino. Now, if we actually think about this is really, really interesting, right? Because not in every country do you have the accessibility of policymakers like you do here. And in not every country do you have policymakers who are like incredibly lucid in thinking about things 5-10 years down the road. So from a particular fintech perspective, I would say the Philippines is really blessed because you have the big involvement for some very smart people at Banco Central. They're actively working with the industry to plan out what comes next. And they're thinking about how can this help the average Filipino and the economy. And I think that's something that, again, if we compare with maybe other countries or others, like let's take the Silicon Valley example. If you're a seed stage startup in Silicon Valley, are you going to be able to meet with the Secretary of the Treasury? Unlikely. But it's possible here because it's all hands on deck to make sure that the digital economy develops in a way that's very productive for society. So that was just one quick one. Maybe Minette, you have anything to add on?
So I was going to echo what JP said about the accessibility of policymakers. Certainly, as Banco Central in the Philippines has been one of the most, globally recognized for progressive thought and the ability to understand the need for digital. Obviously, something that the pandemic's brought forward as well. The Department of Trade and Industry, the Department of ICT, there is such a lot of curiosity about what they might do, even as they try to find a way to bridge between how government works and how startups function quickly. I think the other thing is perhaps there's such a lot of skill, especially around the front end, whether it is customer care or just the UI, UX design. You can see quite a lot of talent in there. I think where we are trying to develop more capability, and you can see a number of investors and companies making an investment in this, is perhaps the back end and data and analytics is something that we are still trying to evolve.
Yeah, actually, similar also to what JP was saying. I know Minette, I also just wanted to call out that I guess in terms of kind of institutional support, we've also seen. I don't know if it's unique to Philippines within the region, but definitely not something that you would find in like would be difficult for most Silicon Valley startups. Is kind of support from the industry leaders on the business side as well, right? And kind of on our side, like working with Globe and Sun Media and ABS from pretty early on, and kind of that sense of they want the startup ecosystem to succeed. I think JP, your answer reminded me of that point as well. I know we just have 4 minutes, so I wanted to also kind of bring us back to kind of right now and this year, right? So obviously, we're in a Zoom conference doing this. It's a pretty different year than usual in a lot of fronts. Do you think? And I think the next 5 years, the way you would have seen it evolve if COVID hadn't happened, is significantly different from the way that you see it kind of playing out because of kind of this Black Swan event. And if so, like, what are the things that that you feel have changed in our trajectory because of this? And or is it just accelerating what you've seen would have happened anyway? So what is, I guess, on that note, just generally, what does the next 5 years kind of look like, the Philippine startup ecosystem for you all? I'll go with to Minette first.
I think maybe one thing I've said over the last decade, one change you're seeing is that frequently consumers have more tech in their homes than they have in their offices. So unlike in the past where maybe your email came from your office first, your machines in the office were more sophisticated, these days that is very different. And I think the pandemic, the quarantines have served to accelerate adoption and have served to make, because the barriers between home and office and school have changed. So I think we will see an acceleration and perhaps even a bigger gap, because the consumers are going to be very, very quick to make the changes to become much more digital. Whereas for corporations, for enterprise, that's a bit of a challenge. So I think unless we all kind of move forward, there will be some inefficiencies going forward. And inefficiencies are always an opportunity for startups.
Yeah, that's a great point. And I think actually for the to your point that the business side has always been slower to adapt than the consumer side here, I think part of what COVID has done was like just force some of those situations, right? Where like a lot of companies have to adapt working remotely, have to figure out a lot of these kind of more digital ways of doing things that just kind of lag behind the consumer adoption, but hopefully is speeding up a bit because of the situation. And then JP, I'd love to hear your thoughts on that as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I definitely agree with everything that Minette mentioned there. Again, from a financial services perspective, clearly, COVID is just pushing into reality trends that were playing out anyway, and would have taken longer to fulfill. And I think Minette touched on all the key drivers there. Another one that I would just touch on as well is, and probably just because we're operating across so many countries in the region, we see this, but the Philippines is a very international, outward-facing society, right? Which is not true of every country in ASEAN. In fact, some ASEAN countries are famously xenophobic and insular. And so I think there is the possibility now for Philippine startups to not only be thinking about the Philippine market, but thinking about the global market as well, right? International quality talent, and in society, you have a very outward-facing mentality as well. So it's a very exciting time for innovation. And I think you'll see more Filipino startups focusing not only on the Philippines, but internationally as well.
Yeah. I guess that's the other effect of this kind of COVID and quarantine situation is that a lot of companies globally are more open to working like not in person, right? Which I think is to your point, the Philippines is in a strong position to take advantage of. It looks like we're finishing up just in time, unless Minette or JP, you had any last thoughts. This was a great, insightful, kind of 25-minute like potent conversation. Yeah, any thought, I guess, maybe in terms of what you hope to see from the or what you're hopeful about, maybe in a sentence or so, when you look at the future of the Philippine startup ecosystem.
If you ask me, I would say more ambition, find the opportunities in the current situation. I think the opportunity for international expansion and international talent and local talent working internationally, these opportunities remain.
Absolutely. And just building upon that, we've got a strong foundation, right? There is a strong several-year track record now of investors, founders, management, etc. So there's a very strong foundation to build upon.
Perfect. Agreed. Thank you all. I guess we just jump off. Thanks everyone for having us. I'm looking forward to the rest of.
Thank you, Rexy. Thank you.
Thanks, Rexy. Thanks, JP.